The dark secrets of America's most notorious criminals. The raid was already over when the detectives arrived. Chicago, 1931. Dawn light crept through shattered windows of a warehouse along the river. The air smelled like gun oil and damp paper. Filing cabinets lay tipped over, their contents spilled across the floor, ledgers, coded notes, envelopes stamped with official seals that should never have been there. The men who ran this place were gone, but what they left behind was worse than bodies. On one page, written in tight, careful handwriting, was a list of payments. Judges, police captains, city inspectors. At the top of the ledger was a single name everyone thought they already understood: Al Capone. Capone was supposed to be simple. A gangster. A brute. A man who ruled Chicago with violence and fear until the law finally caught him. That was the story printed in headlines. But the ledger told a different one where Capone didn't just intimidate the system. He owned it. The payments weren't occasional. They were routine. Weekly. Monthly. Structured like payroll. And suddenly, the question wasn't how Capone stayed free for so long. It was who made sure he did. That question would echo through American criminal history again and again. Because Capone wasn't an exception. He was a template. Decades later, in a different city, another crime scene told the same story in a quieter voice. Seattle, 1974. A young woman vanished from a crowded street in broad daylight. Witnesses remembered a man, polite, well-dressed, his arm in a sling. He asked for help loading books into a car. No force. No panic. Just trust. His name was Ted Bundy. Bundy didn't look like a criminal. That was the point. He understood something law enforcement was slow to learn. People trust what feels familiar. Clean hair. Calm voice. A law student's vocabulary. By the time police realized what they were dealing with, Bundy had already crossed state lines, leaving confusion behind him like smoke. What rarely makes it into summaries is how often he was questioned and released. How many tips were minimized? How many warnings were brushed aside because they didn't fit the profile investigators wanted? Bundy didn't just exploit victims. He exploited systems that preferred order over alarm. Then there was the man who hosted neighborhood parties. Chicago again. Late 1970s. Suburban streets. Block barbecues. Charity events. A contractor who dressed as a clown for children's hospitals. His name was John Wayne Gacy. Police visited Gacy's house more than once. Complaints. Missing persons. Uncomfortable conversations. Each time, he answered the door with confidence. He knew the right people. He spoke their language. He understood the power of appearing respectable. The truth sat beneath his feet. Literally. But the system wasn't looking down. It was looking away. These stories are often told as isolated horrors, monsters slipping through cracks. But when investigators revisited case files decades later, a pattern emerged that was harder to dismiss. In Capone's era, corruption kept the machine running. In Bundy's, fragmentation and poor communication let danger travel freely. In Gacy's, deference and social trust delayed action until it was too late. Different decades. Same outcome. What connects them isn't just the criminals. It's the silence around them. Internal memos revealed tips that went unlogged. Interviews never followed up. Evidence deprioritized because it complicated narratives already forming in the press. In some cases, confessions were pushed forward while contradictory facts were buried. The system didn't fail once. It failed consistently. By the time reforms were proposed, the damage was irreversible. Victims were gone. Families were left with questions that never received clean answers. And the criminals, when finally exposed, were framed as singular evils, allowing institutions to escape scrutiny. That framing was convenient. It still is. When modern researchers compared these cases side by side, they found something unsettling. The same phrases appeared in reports written decades apart. No immediate threat. Insufficient evidence. Low priority at this time. Language that delayed action without denying responsibility. And buried deep in archived correspondence, letters never meant for public release, was a shared fear voiced by officials across generations. Not fear of the criminals. Fear of public panic. Fear of political fallout. Fear of admitting that the safeguards people trusted were far weaker than advertised. The real secret behind America's most notorious criminals isn't how clever or cruel they were. It's how long they were allowed to continue. The story the public received was always cleaner than reality. Arrests were celebrated. Trials were televised. Sentences were framed as closure. But closure is a luxury victims rarely get when truth is rationed. And then came the discovery that forced historians to stop calling these failures coincidences. During a federal records review in the early 2000s, analysts uncovered a classified training document circulated quietly among law enforcement agencies during the mid-20th century. It outlined reputation management strategies, 4 high-profile cases, guidelines on when to release information, when to delay, and when to redirect attention. The goal wasn't justice. It was control. Tucked into the appendix was a handwritten note from an unnamed official, written decades earlier, that would change how these cases were understood. The danger isn't that these men exist. It's that the public learns how long we ignored them. The note reframed everything. The danger isn't that these men exist. It's that the public learns how long we ignored them. For investigators revisiting the past, it wasn't just an admission of failure, it was a blueprint. The document outlined strategies for managing perception when crimes threatened public confidence. Delay releases, narrow suspect pools publicly while expanding them privately, emphasize isolated incidents over patterns. The language was clinical. The effect was lethal. When analysts applied that framework to Capone's Chicago, the ledger suddenly made sense. Capone didn't survive because he was untouchable. He survived because touching him required exposing a web that reached into City Hall and the police department. Raids were staged. Evidence was misplaced. Cases stalled. Each delay bought time. Each delay cost lives. In Bundy's case, the system didn't corrupt itself, it fragmented. Jurisdictions guarded information like territory. Tips from one state took weeks to reach another. Composite sketches didn't travel. Witness descriptions were dismissed because they contradicted early assumptions. Bundy learned the gaps quickly. He exploited them without effort. Investigators later found reports labeled credible that never made it past intake. A woman had described the car. Another had named the suspect. A third had pointed to the same campus where the next disappearance occurred. None of it was connected in time to matter. The danger wasn't Bundy's charm. It was institutional hesitation. John Wayne Gacy's case revealed a different weakness: status. Gacy knew how to perform normalcy. He spoke confidently. He cited connections. When officers questioned him, they felt out of place. He controlled the interaction. Complaints from young men, runaways, marginalized, inconvenient, were coded as unreliable. The basement was ignored because the man upstairs didn't fit the picture. What ties these failures together is not incompetence alone, but prioritization. Systems optimized for order resist disruption. Alarms that don't fit expectations are softened, then silenced. The paperwork reflects this instinct. Words like unsubstantiated, inconclusive, and no immediate threat appear again and again. They don't deny harm. They postpone responsibility. When the cases finally collapsed under their own weight, the narrative pivoted. The criminals were isolated as anomalies, monsters beyond prediction. The institutions framed themselves as responders, not enablers. Reforms were announced. Lessons were promised. But the records tell a colder story. In each case, there was a moment, sometimes many, when intervention was possible. A warrant delayed. A tip deprioritized. A suspect released because the alternative was administrative risk. The calculus wasn't explicit, but it was consistent. Public confidence mattered more than early action. Families of victims felt this instinct most acutely. They encountered the same phrases in different decades. We're doing everything we can. There's not enough to proceed. We don't want to cause panic. Panic, it turned out, was something the system feared more than predators. As journalists began cross-referencing files, another pattern emerged. After arrests, investigations narrowed instead of expanding. Leads that suggested additional victims were marked beyond scope. Confessions were accepted without pressure to corroborate. Closure was prioritized over completeness. It made the ending cleaner. It left the middle unresolved. Capone's downfall is celebrated as a triumph, tax evasion, not murder. What's less discussed is why that path was chosen. Murder cases would have required testimony that exposed compromised officers and judges. Taxes were safer, narrower, sanitized. Bundy's trials created the illusion of total exposure. But case reviews revealed disappearances that didn't fit the timeline prosecutors presented. Some victims remained unlinked because acknowledging them would have required admitting earlier missteps. Gacy's conviction ended questions abruptly. The house was excavated. The count was made. But records show complaints filed after his arrest, reports of missing persons that were quietly closed once a villain had been named. The machine doesn't like unfinished stories. During a congressional review years later, a former administrator testified with rare candor. He described triage justice, the practice of focusing resources where outcomes could be controlled. High-profile cases were dangerous. They invited scrutiny. They exposed seams. The safest move was often the slow one. As Chapter 2 unfolded, investigators realized they weren't just cataloging crimes. They were documenting habits. Institutional reflexes passed down like folklore. Training that emphasized caution over urgency. Metrics that rewarded closure, not truth. Then came the moment that sharpened the stakes. An archivist discovered a suppressed comparison study commissioned in the 1980s. It analyzed response times, tip processing, and interagency communication across major cases, including Capone, Bundy, and Gacy. The conclusion was blunt. Delays correlated directly with body counts. The study had been marked for internal review only. No public release. In the margins, someone had written a question that felt less like analysis and more like confession. What happens when prevention threatens credibility? The answer, written in a different hand below it, was simple and devastating. Prevention waits. As the investigation widened, one last file surfaced, thin, unsigned, and stamped with a warning. It contained a list of reforms proposed after each scandal and quietly abandoned months later. The reasons varied: budget constraints, political resistance, public fatigue. At the bottom of the page was a final annotation, dated years after the last execution, years after the last confession. The crimes end. The habits don't. The crimes end. The habits don't. That sentence became the epitaph for every case file spread across the review table. By the time America's most notorious criminals were finally exposed, the system had already learned how to survive them. Arrests closed chapters. Convictions satisfied the public. Executions and life sentences created the illusion of finality. But the machinery that delayed action, softened warnings, and protected credibility remained intact. Before this story gets buried like the truth it exposes, hit subscribe, tap like, and comment below. Because once you hear these names again, you'll never see them the same way.